Today I'm going to talk about the sewing machine I use to make my dolls. I've been asked many times what kind of sewing machine I recommend, what sort of stitches I use the most, and all that stuff, from beginner doll makers to doll makers that are upgrading their sewing machine. I'm going to go over the details of the sewing machine I use that I think are really helpful when you're sewing doll clothes or making dolls. You don't need all of these accessories and specifics. I just think they come in really handy when you're sewing doll clothes and making dolls. What I would like to recommend to you is that you use a sewing machine that has a very sturdy and perfect straight stitch. For the majority of my sewing work, that's all I use. I use a straight stitch to sew doll bodies. I just reinforce with a second seam. I use a lot of straight stitch obviously when I'm sewing doll clothes, and any basic sewing machine is going to have a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. And with the zigzag stitch, you can finish the raw edges on your doll clothing. I use a serger, but if you are just starting, you can easily finish doll clothing seams with just the zigzag stitch. So let's go over my machine. I have a Memory Craft 6500 by Janome. My husband purchased this sewing machine for me in 2008, I think, at the end of 2008. So it has served me really well all these years. I take really good care of it. I clean it every month. Sometimes I clean it 2 or 3 times a month, especially when I'm sewing with a lot of repurposed sweaters. I make sure I open the bottom plate, and I make sure I take all the fuss out, and then I service it once a month at a sewing machine shop. That keeps the machine working good. I've never had any problems with it, so that's something that you can look into. Janome has very different price ranges, and there's also Bernina. It's also a very good brand. Husqvarna, Pfaff, Juki. They're all good brands for sewing machines. Try going to a sewing shop in your city or in your area and see what sort of machines they provide service for, so that you always know that your machine can be serviced locally. That's really helpful. Okay, so I'll show you of my sewing machine the things that I really like. Okay, one of the things that I like about the machine is this little business, because you don't need to have small spools of thread. You can use really big spools of thread, which becomes really helpful to you if you're always using the same kind of skin tones, or if you have a specific aesthetic to your dolls and you kind of sew a lot with the same colors, then it becomes really cost effective to buy your thread in large cones. And with this sewing machine, it's really simple to use larger cones. These are the basics of the machine. This is so that you can move the speed. I normally sew doll clothes almost at the slowest speed because I like to be really precise, and then I add the speed a little bit more. I almost never sew on the fastest unless I'm making a tablecloth or a skirt for myself or something like that. Obviously the machine threads bobbins for you, and it has an automatic needle threader business that I really like. Let me show you. When you're going to thread your machine, it comes in handy, especially if you don't have really good eyesight. This is a thread to have an automatic needle threader. And so what you do is that you bring this little lever and you place the thread across it. So what it's doing is going behind the needle, and so you grab your thread and you spread it across, and it has a tiny little hook. So then you let go and it pulls the thread through the needle. And so I change thread a lot, I change needles a lot, and so that is one of the features of my sewing machine that I really like, the automatic needle threader. These are my most used buttons, and this one, when I finish sewing, if I press this little button, the machine cuts the threads for me, both the top thread and the bobbin thread, so I don't have to pull the threads. It does also have the cutter at the back like other sewing machines, so if I really want to leave long tails, I do that, but I most often just use this one. It helps to save thread, and it just helps from the constant motion of pulling and cutting the threads at the back of the sewing machine. This little thing is so helpful when you're sewing. What it does is when you press it, it means that every time that you stop sewing, the machine is going to stop with the needle down. And that is so helpful when you're sewing doll bodies, because you want to be able to pivot around thumbs and around little nooks and crannies of the pattern that you're sewing. And otherwise you would have to manually rotate the wheel of the sewing machine to do that. And if you're sewing a lot of doll bodies, or if you are making dolls every month, and when you're sewing doll clothes, it makes it really helpful to be able to do that, because the needle being inside the fabric keeps everything from moving if you have to readjust things. So this thing, love it. This, I love it. This one is also really helpful when you're piecing fabrics, for example, for a quilt, or you're doing a lot of things. When you press this button, what it does is that it automatically finishes your seam by back tacking. It also does it at the beginning, so you start sewing and the machine by itself will take a few stitches forward and a few stitches back, and then continue the seam in whichever stitch pattern that you're using. So you don't have to do it manually, but I use it a lot, but I also use the back tack button. So this one is just whatever you're doing, it will do it in reverse. So if I'm sewing a straight seam and I just want to go back a little bit, this will enable the machine to sew the other way. This is the little wheel that helps you regulate the tension for the upper thread, and we'll go over this little bit. This one just helps you adjust how bright you want the little screen. Mode helps you change between the types of stitches that you do. So the machine comes with a really easy to read, not like 12,000 pages, but like a really easy manual. My machine does embroidery and monogramming and a lot of stuff that I have never used it for, but these are the stitches that you will be using more regularly. Okay, so this is just the regular straight stitch, and you adjust the width and the length of the stitches with these two buttons up here. So this is just a regular straight stitch. This is like a backed for piecing. This is a stitch that you do if you want to do the beginning back tack and the end back tack. So it has a ton of stitches. This is called the Lightning Stitch, and I used to use this stitch a lot when I was sewing stitch. When I was sewing doll bodies at the beginning, I would use this stitch, but I don't use it anymore. This is the zigzag, this is the triple zigzag stitch. I use this a lot when I am sewing wefts because it just adds a couple more stitches in the zigzag. This is the Overcast Stitch. If you don't have a serger, this machine can do this stitch for you and you can finish seams really neatly with it. So it has memory buttons. You can program it to do a certain pattern. But these are the basic stitches that I recommend your sewing machine has. These are the ones that I use most often. It also has a specific button for using double needle, and you can do a really neat things with pin tacks and corded pin tacks and designs, or even finish certain knits with the double needle. This button up here adjusts how much pressure I'm putting on the presser feet. So if I'm using really thick fabrics or repurposed sweaters and I don't want the feed dogs of the machine to put as much pressure on the fabrics, I tailor that pressure with this button. So it's not strictly necessary, but it does help with the finished look and appearance of your sewing if you can also adjust the pressure of the feed dogs, of the presser feet. So this is also very handy. It's really easy as well to change the presser feet of the machine. It just has a tiny little button that releases it and it grabs it on magnetically. So there you go. I'll show you the presser feet the sewing machine came with that I use a lot. Some I don't regularly use very often, but some of them I highly recommend you have them. Like the one I have right now, I like it because the front of the presser foot has plastic so you can see through it. It's not all metal, so that's really handy. This is the box of presser feet that my machine came with. These are guides for when you're quilting. This one I've used too when you're quilting. It holds two fabrics at the same time. Let me grab the manual because I can't remember the names of some of them. So this is the even feed presser foot, and what it does is that it grabs both fabrics and then it like does this to the fabric. And so when you're quilting, it's specifically helpful. Some people use it with knits. I don't. I just lower the pressure on my presser feet so that it doesn't mangle them. This is the foot for buttons. So you place the button right here, the machine calculates its size, and then it makes an automatic buttonhole. The foot that I have on the machine, it's called the zigzag foot, and it's the one that I said has the little plastic at the front. This called the over edge foot. I don't use it very often, but it's the one that you would use if you were doing is the presser foot that you will use if you were doing the overcast stitches. This one I do use quite often. It makes a rolled hem, and it's really easy to feed the fabric through it and to make tiny hems for your doll clothing. I don't do a lot of zippers on my doll clothing, but if you sew for humans, humans love zippers, so this foot is really helpful for that. This is a presser foot for also a zigzag, but it's all plastic, so you can see better. It's all plastic. This presser foot, I don't use it that very often. It's called the open toe satin stitch foot, and these sort of attachments or presser feet are really helpful if you do a lot of embroidery or monograms or stuff like that, which the machine can do. This one's really cute, and it's a cording presser foot. It's a cording presser foot, and it has this little lever thingy where you lift it and put the cords, and it can cord 3 threads at the same time. It's really handy if you'd like to decorate your fabrics. This is the blind hem foot. I also use this a lot when I'm doing hems on my dolls or skirts for myself. This one is the over edge foot. I don't think I've ever used it, to be honest. This one is a 1/4 inch foot, and this one is really helpful when you're piecing quilting, but it's really helpful also for when you're piecing a lot of doll clothes and you just want to make sure that you are sewing 1/4 inch seams. This foot is really nice for that. This is a darner foot, or if you like to do freehand embroidery or freehand quilting, these foot can be really helpful for that. Then obviously the machine comes with like all the regular attachments for cleaning it and whatever. 2 things that I really love about this sewing machine is that the table that it has. This is normally used for when you're quilting to help you hold the fabric, but I find that it's really helpful when I'm sewing doll clothes or doll bodies, because the fabric sits on this side, and as I'm feeding it, it's not hanging down and pulling, so I'm able to like sew really neat and tidy things, right? Because all the fabric has been supported by this machine. Another thing that I really like about the machine, it's a top loading bobbin. So to change the bobbin, all you have to do is take that little window and take it out, and you can fill up another bobbin and then put it in, and that's that. Right, so also because this little window is see-through, you can see how much thread you have left in the bobbin, so you don't run out midway. You can always just be prepared. Those are the features that I love the most about my sewing machine. Like I said, you won't need everything for you to start with, for sure, but it makes it really helpful when you're sewing doll clothes because they're tiny, and when you're sewing doll bodies because we use knit fabrics. Like I said, my best recommendation to you is to use to have a sewing machine that can be serviced where you live, so a brand that is you can easily get it fixed if there's an issue with it, that it does a beautiful straight stitch, and that it's easy to clean, easy to maintain. Some of the features that I think are really helpful are some variety of stitches so that you can get creative when you're making doll clothes, that it has the capability of holding larger cones of thread, that has a top loading bobbin so that it's the least of trouble that you can get when you're sewing, the least barrier of entry that you have to get sewing, the more chances that you will be sewing more often. So top loading bobbin, easy to see how much thread you have in the bobbin, automatic needle threader, automatic cutter, needle down feature. Those are really handy things that my sewing machine has, and that when I, for some reason, sometimes I'm teaching abroad, or I go visit my mother or things like that, and I don't have my sewing machine with me and I have to use other people's sewing machines that are less modernized than mine, I guess, then it's very obvious to me how used I am to the machine doing a lot of work for me, like cutting threads, like threading the needle, like you know, that I can see easily how much thread I have in the bobbin, that the needle goes down whenever I stop, not having to move the wheel by hand. If you're doing lots of bodies or if you are sewing a lot, that's strain on your wrists. So I love my machine. I recommend it. I've always told people you don't need one like mine, but it certainly is really helpful to have something like that. So I hope you have a little bit more knowledge if you are on the lookout for a sewing machine. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you get to make lots of dolls. Bye.